It was August 15th, and I was standing alone by the campfire, staring into the flickering flames as they danced against the encroaching darkness of the forest. My friends were settling into their tents, enjoying the calm of our remote campsite, but I was designated for an extra shift tonight. The usual campsite security was a bit more intense this evening because one of our group, Mike, had gone missing a few days ago. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves and distant calls of nocturnal creatures. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. I was alone on this shift, tasked with keeping watch over the perimeter. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, leaving the campsite shrouded in shadow and a foreboding silence. Every so often, I would check the small radio we had for any updates from the search parties, but it remained dead silent. The isolation started to weigh heavily on me, and I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. I tried to focus on the comforting crackle of the fire, but even that seemed too loud in the stillness. A sudden chill swept through the air, making me shiver despite the warmth of the fire. My flashlight flickered momentarily, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to move just beyond the reach of the light. I found myself straining to hear any sounds that might indicate someone or something approaching. I told myself to stay calm and alert. I was just here to do my job, and hopefully Mike would be found soon. But as the hours dragged on, the sense of unease grew stronger, and I couldn't help but wonder what was lurking in the darkness around me. As dawn broke on August 16th, 2021, I reluctantly wrapped up my shift, feeling the weight of a sleepless night. The forest was waking up with the chirping of birds and the rustle of small animals, but the unsettling quiet of the previous night lingered in my mind. I walked the perimeter one last time before heading back to the campsite, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. While examining the area, I stumbled upon a small, weathered object partially buried in the dirt. It was Mike's pocket knife, its once shiny surface now tarnished and grimy. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. I hadn't seen it before, and it shouldn't have been here. I picked it up, hoping it was just a coincidence, but it felt like an ominous sign. The camp's radio crackled to life just as I was about to return to the main site, and I eagerly grabbed it. The voice on the other end was faint, but unmistakably frantic, mentioning something about strange noises and sightings in the woods. I couldn't make out all the details, but it was clear that the search for Mike was becoming more urgent. Throughout the day, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I caught myself looking over my shoulder frequently, each rustle of leaves or snap of a twig setting my nerves on edge. The forest, which had once seemed serene, now felt like a vast, looming presence. As evening approached, I was assigned another shift, this time with a partner. Despite the company, the strange events of the past night and the sight of Mike's pocket knife weighed heavily on me. We set out together, determined to find some answers. But the shadows of the forest seemed to grow darker with each step we took. Night fell on August 17th, 2021, and the forest once again enveloped us in darkness. My partner and I walked through the thick underbrush, our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the blackness. The eerie silence of the forest was punctuated only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Each sound seemed magnified, heightening our sense of dread. As we ventured deeper, we noticed signs of recent activity, broken branches and displaced leaves. Something, or someone, had been moving through this area recently. Our footsteps echoed unnervingly loud in the quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. The shadows seemed to twist and stretch, playing tricks on our eyes. We decided to investigate a faint, flickering light in the distance, hoping it might lead us to some clue. As we approached, the light turned out to be a small, abandoned campfire, its embers still glowing faintly. Next to it lay a collection of strange symbols carved into the ground, their meanings unknown but unsettling in their complexity. A sudden, cold breeze swept through the clearing, extinguishing our flashlights for a moment. In the darkness, we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on leaves, but they were not our own. We quickly turned on our flashlights, but the clearing was empty and the footsteps had ceased. The tension between us was palpable as we exchanged nervous glances. We continued our search, but the deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The forest seemed to close in on us, and every shadow felt like it was watching. We found no further clues, but the sense of foreboding lingered, leaving us on edge as we made our way back to the campsite. On August 18th, 2021, we woke to find the forest bathed in an eerie mist. My partner and I were exhausted, but determined to continue our search for Mike. The mist clung to the trees and ground, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. Every sound seemed muffled, and visibility was reduced to mere feet. As we navigated through the dense fog, I noticed a faint trail of disturbed ground leading away from the camp. We followed it carefully, stepping over fallen branches and through thick undergrowth. The trail led us to a small, hidden clearing, where we found a makeshift shelter. Inside the shelter, huddled in a corner, was Mike. He looked disheveled and confused, but otherwise unharmed. Relief washed over me as I approached him, calling out his name. He looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and recognition. He mumbled about hearing strange noises and feeling like he was being followed. We quickly contacted the search team to let them know we had found Mike. As they arrived and began to take him to safety, Mike shared more details about his experience. He spoke of shadows moving in the forest and a feeling of being constantly watched. His account matched the eerie occurrences we had experienced. With Mike safely back and the search finally over, the campsite began to feel normal again. The unsettling atmosphere lifted, and we were able to reflect on the terrifying ordeal we had been through. The forest, once a source of dread, now seemed to return to its peaceful state, leaving us with a sense of closure and relief. By August 19th, 2021, the campsite had returned to a semblance of normalcy. Mike was recovering, and the rest of us were adjusting back to our routine. The forest that had seemed so menacing now appeared tranquil in the daylight. The events of the past few days felt like a surreal nightmare that we had finally woken from. The search team conducted a thorough investigation, but found no evidence of any unusual activity other than the disturbances we had reported. The strange symbols and eerie noises remained unexplained, but they were chalked up to natural occurrences and our heightened sense of alert. We were left with more questions than answers. We held a small gathering around the campfire that evening to reflect on our ordeal. There was an air of camaraderie and relief among us as we recounted the events and shared our feelings. Laughter and storytelling replaced the fear and tension that had dominated the past few nights. As we packed up our gear and prepared to leave the campsite, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. We had come through a harrowing experience, and despite the lingering mystery, we were able to return home safely. The forest would remain a place of both beauty and fear in our memories. With the campsite empty and the forest silent once more, we drove away with a renewed appreciation for the safety of our everyday lives. The ordeal had tested our resilience, but it also brought us closer together. The campfire that had once been a source of comfort now stood as a reminder of the strength and courage we had found within ourselves. It was October 23rd, and I found myself standing at the edge of a dense, shadowy forest in the heart of a remote national park. As the park ranger assigned for the night shift, I was tasked with patrolling the area after recent reports of unusual sightings. The moonlight barely pierced through the thick canopy of trees, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The forest was unnaturally quiet, a silence that seemed almost oppressive. The radio crackled softly in my hand, and I adjusted the frequency, hoping for some communication from the other rangers or updates on the situation. The only response was static, and a chill ran down my spine as I realized how isolated I was. The feeling of being alone in such a vast expanse of wilderness was unsettling, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig seemed magnified in the dark. I began my patrol, carefully stepping over fallen branches and navigating the uneven terrain. The shadows played tricks on my eyes, making the trees seem like twisted figures lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Each beam of light seemed to cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of the forest's intricate, almost malevolent beauty. I kept my senses on high alert, trying to ignore the growing unease gnawing at my gut. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I noticed something odd. A series of small, irregularly placed stones arranged in a pattern on the forest floor. They were not natural formations, and the arrangement seemed deliberate, though I couldn't discern any clear meaning. The stones formed a rough circle, with a small pile of twigs and leaves in the center. I hesitated, feeling a strange compulsion to investigate, but also a powerful sense of dread. Just as I was about to examine the stones more closely, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing. The forest remained as silent as before, the only sounds my own breathing and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the eerie feeling creeping over me. It must have been the wind, or my imagination playing tricks on me. I moved on, determined to continue my patrol and find some explanation for the reports of unusual activity. The deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated and unnerving it became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches forming twisted shapes against the night sky. Every so often, I would hear a rustling sound or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked directly, there was nothing there. As the hours passed, the forest grew colder, and the sense of isolation intensified. My radio continued to emit only static, and I began to feel as though I was being watched. The quiet was deafening, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, creating eerie shapes that danced just beyond my line of sight. I found myself straining to hear any sound that might indicate another presence, but all I could hear was the relentless silence. I decided to take a short break and sit down on a large rock, hoping to calm my nerves and gather my thoughts. The forest around me was still and silent, the only light coming from the moon and my flashlight. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, and scanned the area for any sign of unusual activity. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Suddenly, I noticed something glinting in the underbrush not far from where I was sitting. I stood up and approached cautiously, shining my flashlight on the object. It was an old, rusted metal box, partially buried in the dirt. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to open it, despite the growing sense of unease. Inside, I found an assortment of strange items: old photographs, a weathered journal, and several small crude carvings. The photographs were faded and torn, depicting scenes of people in old-fashioned clothing, their faces obscured or turned away from the camera. The journal was filled with handwritten notes in an unfamiliar language, its pages yellowed and brittle. The carvings were small, intricate, and seemed to represent symbols or figures that I couldn't understand. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that these items seemed out of place in the forest, and their presence added to the growing sense of mystery. The night deepened, and the forest seemed to grow even darker and more oppressive. The chill in the air was palpable, seeping through my uniform despite the layers I wore. I continued my patrol, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the inky blackness and revealing the twisted silhouettes of trees that seemed to shift and sway in the darkness. The strange arrangement of stones from earlier still weighed heavily on my mind. As I moved deeper into the forest, I noticed an increasing number of peculiar formations, piles of rocks, broken branches, and disturbed earth, all arranged in patterns that were difficult to interpret. Each new formation added to the sense of unease, as if the forest itself was conspiring to unsettle me. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life with a burst of static, followed by a garbled message that was barely intelligible. I stopped in my tracks, straining to make out the words. It sounded like someone was trying to communicate, but was either too far away or was experiencing technical difficulties. I responded with my location and a request for clarification, but there was no reply. The static buzzed in my ear, and then the radio fell silent again. I pressed on, trying to focus on my surroundings and the task at hand. The silence of the forest was occasionally broken by the sound of my footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of something moving in the peripheral vision. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The forest seemed alive with unseen presences, and the sense of being watched grew stronger with every step. After a few hours, I reached a small clearing that wasn't on my map. The moonlight illuminated the area, revealing an old, dilapidated cabin in the center. The cabin was weather-beaten, with its wooden walls covered in moss and vines. The door hung ajar, creaking slightly in the breeze. I hesitated, feeling a strange compulsion to investigate, but also a deep-seated fear of what I might find inside. Summoning my courage, I approached the cabin and pushed the door open further. The interior was dark and musty, with a faint smell of decay and mildew. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight revealing a clutter of old furniture, broken windows, and cobwebs. There was a heavy layer of dust over everything, indicating that no one had been here for a long time. I carefully inspected the room, noting the old, faded photographs that hung crookedly on the walls. They depicted scenes of people I didn't recognize, their faces half hidden in shadow. Among the debris, I found a journal lying open on a dusty table. The pages were yellowed and fragile, and I hesitated before turning them, the creaking of the pages loud in the silence. The journal contained scribbled notes and sketches, most of which were indecipherable. However, one entry caught my eye. It was a drawing of the same strange stone patterns I had seen earlier, along with hastily written text that spoke of rituals and calling the spirits. The entry was signed by someone named Evelyn, and the final lines mentioned a ceremony tonight. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I read the entry. The journal suggested that something was planned for this night, something that involved the very patterns I had discovered. I quickly closed the journal and stepped back outside, my heart racing. The forest seemed even darker now, the trees pressing in on me as if eager to hide their secrets. As I made my way back toward the main patrol route, the radio crackled again, this time with a clearer voice. It was another ranger, reporting a disturbance near the edge of the park. The message was brief, but urgent, indicating that there might be people in the area conducting some sort of ritual or gathering. The ranger's voice was tinged with concern, and I could sense the rising tension. I acknowledged the message and resumed my patrol, keeping a sharp lookout for anything unusual. The shadows in the forest seemed to lengthen, and the sense of foreboding grew stronger with each passing minute. The mysterious patterns, the abandoned cabin, and the journal's cryptic message weighed heavily on my mind. I knew I needed to be cautious, but the desire to uncover the truth and ensure the safety of the park was driving me forward. As I approached the area where the disturbance had been reported, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something that would reveal the true nature of the enigma that had enveloped the forest. The night was far from over, and the forest held its secrets close, ready to unveil them at the most unexpected moment. The air inside the cabin was musty and thick with the smell of mold and decay. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped cautiously over the threshold. The flashlight beam swept across the interior, revealing dust-covered furniture and cobwebs draped like curtains. The cabin appeared to have been abandoned for years, yet something about it felt unsettlingly current, as if it had been waiting for me. The walls were adorned with faded photographs and drawings, their edges curling and yellowing with age. I examined them closely, finding images of people who seemed both familiar and strange. The faces in the photos were weathered and obscured, but their eyes seemed to follow me, adding to the sense of unease. The drawings, crude and hastily done, depicted strange symbols and figures that I couldn't decipher. As I moved further into the cabin, I noticed a small, rickety staircase leading to an upper loft. My flashlight cast long shadows on the walls as I ascended the stairs, each step groaning underfoot. The loft was sparsely furnished with a single bed, a wooden trunk, and a few scattered items. The bed was unmade, and the trunk was partially open, revealing a collection of old clothes and miscellaneous belongings. I approached the trunk with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Inside, I found a stack of yellowed papers and a leather-bound journal. I picked up the journal, its cover cracked and worn. The pages were filled with hurriedly scrawled notes and drawings that seemed to document a descent into paranoia. The entries described sightings of shadowy figures, strange noises in the night, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. One entry stood out. It detailed a ritual involving the symbols I had seen earlier, claiming that they were meant to summon or communicate with entities from another realm. The description was vague and incoherent, but it spoke of a growing darkness and a sense of impending doom. The writer's fear was palpable, and I could almost feel their anxiety seeping through the pages. I heard a sudden noise from downstairs, a faint, echoing thud that made my heart race. I quickly closed the journal and returned it to the trunk, then descended the stairs with caution. The cabin's silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building. I scanned the room, trying to locate the source of the sound. Outside, the mist had thickened, and visibility was severely reduced. I stepped out of the cabin, my flashlight barely cutting through the dense fog. The forest seemed different now, more foreboding, as if the cabin had somehow shifted the atmosphere. The stone formations and strange symbols from earlier felt like they were closing in on me, their meanings becoming more ominous with every passing moment. I decided to leave the cabin and continue my patrol, though the feeling of dread was almost overwhelming. The cabin had provided more questions than answers, and the sense of being watched was now accompanied by a growing sense of urgency. I had to find out what was happening in the forest and whether there was a real threat or if it was all a figment of my imagination. As I walked through the foggy forest, the shadows seemed to move with me, their forms twisting and changing with every step. The whispers from earlier had returned, faint and indecipherable, as if the forest itself was speaking to me. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but the feeling of being pursued was inescapable. With every step, the forest grew darker, and the fog seemed to thicken, obscuring my path. The sense of foreboding was nearly palpable, and I felt as if I was walking through a dream or a nightmare. The only certainty was that something was terribly wrong, and I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how disturbing it might be. The thud from downstairs jolted me out of my thoughts. My heart raced as I carefully descended the stairs, trying to keep my breathing steady. The musty smell of the cabin seemed to intensify, mingling with the growing scent of fear. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to dance and shift in unsettling ways. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed that the front door, which had been ajar, was now slightly more open. A cold draft rushed in, causing the door to creak ominously. I hesitated for a moment, then approached the door, my flashlight probing the area outside. The forest was silent, but there was an uncanny stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped outside, scanning the surroundings. The mist had thickened, and visibility was reduced to only a few feet. The eerie silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I moved cautiously, my flashlight beam sweeping over the underbrush and trees. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was lurking just out of sight. Suddenly, I heard a low, almost inaudible whisper carried on the wind. I stopped and strained to listen, but the whisper was too faint to discern. It seemed to come from all directions at once, a haunting murmur that sent chills down my spine. I called out, "Is anyone there?" But the only response was the whispering wind and the rustling leaves. I decided to investigate further, following the direction of the whisper. As I moved deeper into the forest, the whispers grew louder and more distinct, though still unintelligible. The forest seemed to close in around me, the the trees pressing closer together, as if they were trying to keep me from leaving. The mist swirled around my feet, making the ground slippery and treacherous. The whispers led me to a small clearing that I hadn't noticed before. In the center of the clearing was a large, ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like twisted arms. Around the base of the tree were more of the strange symbols I had seen earlier, etched into the ground and the trunk of the tree. The symbols glowed faintly in the dim light, casting an eerie, phosphorescent glow. I approached the tree cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the symbols. They seemed to shift and change as I moved the beam, creating a disorienting effect. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as if the forest itself was trying to warn me away. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a cacophony of disembodied voices that seemed to swirl around me. My flashlight flickered and dimmed, and I struggled to keep it steady as I tried to make sense of the symbols. The whispers were now a jumble of incoherent phrases and urgent tones. I could feel the forest closing in, the trees seeming to lean closer as if they were listening to the voices as well. A sudden, sharp gust of wind extinguished my flashlight, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for the spare batteries in my pocket, my hands shaking as I tried to replace them. The whispers grew frantic, and I felt a cold, clammy hand brush against my arm. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the darkness and the oppressive silence of the forest. As I managed to get the flashlight working again, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was shrouded in shadow, its features indistinguishable. I felt a surge of fear and adrenaline as I realized that I was not alone. The figure seemed to move with the shadows, its presence both haunting and elusive. Before I could react, the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone in the clearing with the eerie symbols and the fading whispers. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The forest was silent once more, but the sense of unease lingered. I knew I had to return to the cabin and report what I had seen, but the darkness and the shadows seemed to follow me as I made my way back. The ancient tree in the center of the clearing was massive, its gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. Its trunk was covered in dark, deep grooves that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light of my flashlight. I approached cautiously, feeling an odd mix of curiosity and dread. The whispers had become almost a constant hum, their source still hidden from view. I circled the tree, noting the strange symbols carved into its bark. They matched the ones I had seen in the cabin, their patterns both intricate and menacing. As I examined the carvings, I felt a sudden, sharp chill, as if an icy breath had brushed against my skin. The whispers seemed to grow more urgent, their tone shifting from eerie murmurs to something more desperate. The ground around the tree was disturbed, with patches of earth dug up as if someone or something had been digging. I noticed a small, makeshift altar constructed from rocks and bones. Candles, now melted and hardened, were scattered around the altar, their wax dripped in strange patterns. The whole scene felt like a macabre ritual site, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. As I stood there, a feeling of being watched intensified. The forest seemed to close in, and the whispers grew louder, though their words remained indecipherable. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing to be seen. The only movement was the swirling mist and the occasional rustle of leaves. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and the forest felt unnaturally still. My flashlight flickered, and I had to tap it to get it working again. When the light returned, I noticed a shadow moving among the trees, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. My pulse quickened, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The sense of danger was palpable, and I knew I needed to leave the clearing and return to the safety of the cabin. I turned to head back, but as I retraced my steps, the ground seemed to shift beneath me. The mist had thickened, and the once familiar path now seemed foreign and disorienting. The whispers resumed, but now they sounded almost like a chant, growing louder and more insistent. I felt a pressure in the air, as if the forest itself was trying to push me away. The shadows seemed to move with purpose, and I had the unsettling feeling that something was tracking my every step. When I finally reached the cabin, I was breathless and disoriented. I locked the door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to calm my racing heart. The cabin was still and silent, but the sense of unease lingered. I glanced around the room, my flashlight beam catching the outlines of the strange symbols and notes from the journal. As I sat down, trying to collect my thoughts, the radio crackled to life again, its message still garbled and indecipherable. I attempted to make contact, but the static remained. The forest outside seemed to be holding its breath, and I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me. The whispers and shadows of the forest had left an indelible mark on me. I knew that whatever was happening in the woods was beyond my understanding, and the sense of mystery and danger was only growing stronger. As I settled in for the night, the feeling of being watched persisted, and the eerie silence of the cabin was interrupted only by the occasional creak of the old building. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, and sleep was elusive. The forest outside remained a dark, enigmatic presence, its secrets hidden in the shadows and whispers that continued to haunt me.